Okay, so we have talked about two of the Matins poems. We have a shift now as we come up to our next poem in the selection. We're going to talk about a Vespers poem. And so we are seeing a shift from like the morning to the evening because, as we remember, Vespers is a word for afternoon or evening prayers when we're thinking about these like liturgical prayers or these church prayers. Um, and so this is going to be the Vespers prayer that we talk about. It's on page 20. The first line is, "In your extended absence, you permit me." And so we are going to take a look at that now. Okay, so let's take a look at our Vespers poem. Um, Again, we're looking here at an evening prayer. We are looking at our speaker, of course, as our poet gardener, just as it was in our matins. And our audience, like we saw in the last Matins poem that we looked at, "What is my heart to you?" Again, we have the direct address, and our audience again is our God, bigger deity. And so we are seeing a shift in the day because, as we know, the wild iris as a collection or as a whole goes throughout the course of a day and kind of details the poet gardeners in the way that they move through a day in their garden and the way that they kind of interact with the flowers and everything like that. You guys have videos on the some of the other poems that speak specifically about the flowers. And so we are focusing on this kind of relationship here between the speaker, the poet gardener, and the audience, the god, the deity. So we started exploring that in the Matins poems that we looked at earlier. Now we are shifting to Vespers into evening, and we're looking at the kind of evolution of this relationship. So in our last Matins, again, "What is my heart to you?" we saw this poet gardener talking a lot about like or questioning God, asking what is the point of the isolation and the suffering that this God is putting her through. And so we are going to maybe not see as much questioning in this one. Let's look at how the speaker addresses the God in this poem. So the first thing we learn is that the this God, deity, whatever we're thinking about here, has been absent, right? "In your extended absence, you permit me use of earth, anticipating some return on investment." And so this idea of like the fact that this deity is like expecting something back, right? A return on investment. This the use of this like financial language shows us this that at least the speaker perceives the relationship between herself and this deity to be transactional, right? You give me use of earth, you expect something back in return. And so she says, "I must report failure in my assignment, principally regarding the tomato plants." And so we have this kind of like light tone here because it's amusing. She says, like, I must report failure principally regarding the tomato plants, right? Like she has failed, and we're going to put that in quotes because again it's not a huge failure. That's the thing, is we're using this kind of elevated language about something that feels less serious, right? Like she's failed to cultivate tomatoes. um, so she goes on to say, "I think I should not be encouraged to grow tomatoes," right? Like I'm not really good at it. So again, we're using the natural world, this idea of tomato plants and growing and everything like that. We're using that as basically this metaphor to explore this relationship. She says, "I think I should not be encouraged to grow tomatoes. Or if I am, you should withhold the heavy rains, the cold nights that come so often here, while other regions get 12 weeks of summer." So again, our speaker here is talking about like what the God could do to help her out, right? Withhold the heavy rains, withhold the cold nights. Basically, she's saying it's not fair that I'm being expected to grow these tomatoes when I don't have the right conditions. And again, we know that this is metaphorical, right? And so we have again this imagery of weather, the natural world, of course. She says, "All this belongs to you." right? This idea of like the weather, the rains, all of that belongs to you. It is in your control. On the other hand, she says, I planted the seeds. I watched the first shoots like wings tearing the soil, and it was my heart broken by the blight, the black spot so quickly multiplying in the rows. So again, we have imagery, and here it's imagery of growth, right? Planting the seeds, watching the first shoots, like wings tearing the soil, which is like this idea of like the seeds almost like flying out of the ground. And it says, and it was my heart broken by the blight, the black spot so quickly multiplying in the rows. So it's the growth of the plants. And interestingly enough, it's also the growth of like this like tomato fungus or whatever it is. Like she calls it a blight, the black spot. Um, so it's the growth of that as well. Um, and we have this contrast here between the I and the you, right? Like you control this weather stuff, but this is the work that I did, right? We have all of these actions here. I planted the seeds. I watched the first shoots. My heart was broken by the blight. Um, and so that I versus you continues, right? I doubt you have a heart in our understanding of that term. And so I would argue that this is where we have a shift, right? Because up until this point, we've had kind of this like light tone or lighter tone. And here it shifts and it becomes more kind of angry and accusatory. Accusatory, if I could spell that. In fact, the speaker is saying, I don't think that you have a heart, right? This idea of the heart as this metonymy for like feelings or empathy. And she says, not in our understanding of that term. You who do not discriminate between the dead and the living, who are in consequence immune to foreshadowing, you may not know. So again, all these I's, and then we have repetition of all these yous, right? This is how what I was doing. These are the things that I was feeling. You don't understand that, right? Because you don't understand us as humans, right? Because you don't discriminate between the dead and the living. And she says, you may not know how much terror we bear. And then she goes back to this imagery of the natural world. The spotted leaf, or yeah, the red leaves of the maple falling, again, that idea of a falling leaf showing us this kind of idea of death, right? Falling even in August in early darkness. She says, I am responsible for these vines, right? So she feels what she calls basically the terror of mortality and death in a way that the speaker can't. And she uses imagery of nature to show, right, the spotted leaf, the red, like the spotted leaf, like referring back to this idea of like the blight that happens, right? The red leaves of the maple falling, the early darkness, right? So she is showing us here basically this, focusing here on as far as major thematic themes, she's illustrating this difference that she sees between humans and the divine. It's interesting because she seems to prize the sense of personal responsibility, right? I am responsible for these vines. She seems to think that her feelings and her sense of personal responsibility here give her a closer connection to the things that she's cultivating. It's almost like she seems to wish, or at least to like desire, or like kind of hope that the deity would feel that too. So she wishes or desires for the deity to also feel that responsibility. for her, right? Because she says, I'm responsible for the tomatoes. You're supposed to be responsible for me in that same way. And you just don't have those same feelings, right? Like, I feel more for the tomatoes. I feel more for these falling leaves. I feel more when I see this early darkness. I feel more for that than you do for me. And I wish you felt more for me. Um, and so here we have this imagery of like growth, and here we have imagery again of nature, but particularly this idea of death, right? So we have the growth versus the death contrast happening again. So a little bit of a different kind of approach to the audience, right? To this God, to this deity. We had the like early reflection on how she perceived nature as the poet gardener. In the next one, in What Is My Heart to You, we had her kind of talking about asking or questioning like the point of her isolation and suffering. Here we have her in a lot of ways kind of criticizing the God or the deity that we're looking at here and saying, like, hey, I feel responsibility. You don't seem to. And she seems to be upset about that. So we're seeing this kind of transformation, or at least this change in attitude over the course of these poems throughout the Wild Iris.